Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fred McClure, and on behalf of the President, Mrs. Bush, and the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation, welcome to our very special event this evening, where we have a longtime observer of politics in America, even though he's kind of a young guy, a longtime observer of politics and writing about politics, and tonight he'll get to talk to you about a book he has co-authored on the presidency. Beginning as a staff writer for Defense Week at the Pentagon, Michael Duffy in 1985 joined Time magazine, covering the Pentagon, Congress, and also the White House. From 95 to 96, he was a national political correspondent for Time magazine, and from 97 to 2005, served as the Washington bureau chief. In the middle of that, in 2001, he became assistant managing editor of Time magazine. He is the author of more than 50 cover stories that Time magazine has published. A graduate of Oberlin College in Ohio, he's a regular on PBS Washington Week with Gwen Ifill. He's seen on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and even that Chris Matthews show. Twice he has won the Gerald R. Ford Award for distinguished reporting. He's co-authored 2 books in addition to The President's Club, the one that we have here that will be for sale outside when we get done and for signatures, and which will be the subject of this evening's gathering. He and his wife have 3 sons. They live outside Washington, D.C. in the great state of Maryland. We were worried about whether he was going to get here today. Washington, D.C. thought this morning that they were going to have 5 to 10 inches of snow, and once again the weathermen were wrong. I was happy that I was not going to have to be shoveling snow since I now live here in Texas, and so that was a good thing. I also am very happy to have Michael here and to introduce him because he became a good friend during our days in the White House during the Bush administration. Please welcome my friend Michael Duffy.
Thank you, Fred, for that introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be here tonight. If this doesn't turn out well, please don't blame Fred. Fred is an Aggie to the core. He's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet, plus he can sing. And my father always said to my sisters, it's not every day you meet a guy like that. I also want to thank Noni Fisher and Angie Cooper, who were very patient with me as we were trying to get down here. You guys were great. I know you're out there. Thank you again. But most of all, it's an honor to be here at the Bush Center because this institution is dedicated to the enduring. It's just a tribute to the lives and the service of President Bush and Mrs. Bush, to all the amazing model they have set for so many people, an amazing family. And you're both here tonight, which is a special treat for me, and I know everybody else in the room. You look great. Thank you so much for having me. It's just wonderful for me. I'm here tonight to talk about the President's Club, and College Station is a great place to do it because it has a place in the club's history. It was 24 years ago this spring, on a May afternoon in 1989, that President Bush came to College Station to give a speech that really framed his foreign policy for the next 4 years, that set up American approach to the end of the Soviet Union. He called it in that speech a generation's work, and he invoked in that speech 2 other presidents, a Democrat, Harry Truman, and a Republican, Dwight Eisenhower, and he said, essentially, this is the work of many years, many decades, many presidents. And it was in that College Station speech that he said, I will try to complete this transition from a country that was held in tyranny to a country that was in freedom. He did complete that work, and he knew and said in that speech that that was not just him, that it was every president since World War II who had lent a hand, and he was just the one to bring it to a close. He was saying, in effect, in that speech in May, it was a little warmer spring day than this, but it was still pretty lovely, that presidencies sometimes aren't measured by just a matter of a year or 2. What presidents accomplish sometimes takes multiple presidencies. And it's in that, the presidents know this in a way that we often don't. And it's in that spirit that I want to talk tonight about the President's Club. When Nancy Gibbs, my colleague at Time, and she was supposed to be here tonight, but we have a magazine to put out. When we first thought up the club, we were thinking that it was kind of an informal idea, just something we talked about, how the men got along. But as we got into it, we realized it wasn't just an imaginary idea. There were elements of it that really are like a club, a little bit like a fraternity. And so I want to just walk you through what we think are some of the high points of the partnerships that took place over the last 65 years. Our story starts with these two men who had not very much in common. And this picture was taken about 10 minutes after Harry Truman became president in 1945. The world was still at war, but the war in Europe was coming to an end. And Mr. Truman had a big problem. Europe was starving. Now, Herbert Hoover had not been in the White House ever since he left it in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt never invited him back. Hoover was a very useful battering ram for the New Deal Democrats, and as Roosevelt liked to say, I'm not Jesus Christ, I'm not raising Herbert Hoover from the dead. Well, Harry Truman was from Missouri. He didn't care about that. He had a problem. 100 million Europeans were starving. In Holland, they were taking the bulbs of tulips and cutting out the poison center and trying to make soup. Truman had to feed the people, and he looked around the United States, and there was only one person who had done it before, and that was Hoover. And so he sends Hoover a secret letter. He has to do it secretly so that the Roosevelt New Dealers didn't know. And when Hoover gets the secret letter from Truman, he thinks it's a trap. And so he doesn't answer it. So Truman sends more letters and makes calls and gets people to call, and finally he gets Hoover into the White House to talk about this problem. And Hoover is so overcome with emotion at being invited back, finally, that he breaks down into tears, or at least that's what Truman said later. But at any rate, they became partners, and within 2 or 3 weeks, Truman had given Hoover a plane, a staff of 30, and Hoover was on a 6-week trip around the world in which he met something like 20 prime ministers, 7 kings, and the Pope. And he basically, over the summer of 1945 and into the fall, moved 110 billion metric tons of grain from this hemisphere to that one. And these two men probably did more to save the lives of people in the 20th century than anyone else. And hardly anyone knows the story. They also went on to reorganize the federal government together and give the modern presidency the tools that every president after them would thank them for. The National Security Council, the CIA, essentially repowered the executive branch after World War II and made the modern presidency what it was. These two men did that. Amazing. So that when they got to the dais of the swearing in of Dwight Eisenhower in 1953, I guess, because it was 52, 53, Hoover gets up on the stage before they swear in Ike, and he walks over to Truman and he says, I think we ought to start a president's club. And Truman says, fine. You'll be the president, I'll be the secretary. And of course they were joking in a way, but they'd already done amazing things together, and they kind of wanted to keep it going. Over the course of the next 25 years, the club began to get things. Eisenhower gave them franking privileges, and I believe Johnson gave them Secret Service protection, or maybe it was the other way around. By the time Richard Nixon becomes president, he gives the club something every club needs, a clubhouse. And the clubhouse is on right across the street from the White House. It's in an unmarked brownstone. It's a great story about how the clubhouse came to be. One day, Richard Nixon was president. It's about 1969. Lyndon Johnson has just gone back, to his ranch on the Pedernales, and he's restless. He doesn't know what to do. And he's calling the White House all the time, and he wants to come to town, and he wants a place to stay. And Nixon got so tired of dealing with Johnson's request that he gave the Johnson account to a young military aide, an Air Force colonel by the name of Brent Scowcroft. And Scowcroft at first thought this was General Scowcroft, he was a major then. I should just say Brent, but it's hard for me to do that. Scowcroft at first was annoyed by all these calls he was getting from Johnson. He told me, but then he began to kind of like him. He began to enjoy the conversations, and he found him, against his initial impulse, thought Johnson was kind of fun. And so Scowcroft scrounged around the GSA and found the clubhouse. We'll come back to that in the story, but it's an interesting little bit of history. The club has done some things to protect the presidency. The men who have been or will be president understand the importance in our country of having a powerful executive. When other branches of the government don't work, I know that never happens, but when other branches of the government seem not to function very well, it's important for us as a country and as a people to have an executive branch that works. This is a great picture taken 3 or 4 days after the election in 1960, which you all recall, according to myth, Kennedy won. It depends on how you count votes in Chicago and Texas, but the story goes that Kennedy won. And Richard Nixon was under some pressure to contest this election. And his own daughters had given their allowance to the recount effort. And so Nixon was conflicted. And he goes down to vacation, I guess, in Key Biscayne a few days after the election, and Kennedy is up at the compound there in one of those, I can't remember the name, I guess Palm Beach, right? And Nixon's trying to decide whether to contest the election, and he gets a call from Herbert Hoover. And Hoover says, they know, the two men had known each other for 10 years, and he says, don't do it. It's not the signal. He says, I think we're in enough trouble in the world today. Some indications of national unity are not only desirable, but essential. And Nixon knows that's right, but he wants to talk to someone else. So he calls Eisenhower, who's still president. And he says, Hoover just called, says I shouldn't contest. And Eisenhower says to Nixon, we're in the middle of the Cold War. We have to send a signal that our democracy works. We can't have a contested election. And what you ought to do is call Kennedy up and go see him. And Nixon does. And that's the picture that came out of it the next day. It's hard to imagine that happening today. Maybe not, but it's an interesting bit of history to have 3 presidents on the phone talking to a 4th, all in the space of an hour. The youngest president in a century and the oldest president in a century had known each other before the 1960 election. They didn't much care for each other. Eisenhower called Kennedy "Little Boy Blue." Kennedy's expression for Eisenhower cannot be repeated in this setting. And when Kennedy came into office, he thought he would take Eisenhower's White House, which was very military-oriented and hierarchical, and only certain people could get into the Oval Office, and that made sense, and he'd tear it up and start anew, and he'd make himself the center of all these spokes. And it was a disaster. And that was proven about 6 weeks into his presidency when the Bay of Pigs happened. This picture was taken 2 days later at Camp David, where Kennedy invited Eisenhower to come down from Gettysburg and talk about what happened. Kennedy was looking for support. The nation and the world were thinking, does this man know what he's doing? So they have a very celebrated picture, but first that, they have a conversation in one of the cottages there. It was a literal trip to the woodshed. Now remember, this is Camp David. Kennedy had never been to Camp David until this picture had been taken. That would be Camp David, named after Eisenhower's grandson, David. And Eisenhower just grills Kennedy in the meeting. He says, who did you talk to? What generals did you listen to? What did you ask them? When did you ask them? How many meetings did you have? He just gives them the 3rd degree about his process. And at the end of that session, Kennedy turns to Eisenhower and says, I wish I'd known this 6 weeks ago. This is a really hard job. And Eisenhower says, I tried to warn you. And then an amazing thing happened. The 2 men come out of the cottage, come down the path to the waiting photographers, because the meeting was about the picture. Kennedy wanted the picture of the old savior of Europe standing next to him. And Eisenhower stands up in front of the reporters and says, I think we should support the president. I support what he did. Now that's really something. He couldn't have agreed with it at all. But he said, for the good of the country, we have to come together at times of national crisis. And Eisenhower would go back to Gettysburg that night where some of his older advisors were waiting for him, And they were kind of rubbing their hands, okay, now we can go after him. And Eisenhower said, no, that's not where I'm going. It's a phrase you'll see repeated later in the President's Club. I stuck this picture in because, simply for the outfit. What happened to the smoking jacket? It's gone. I don't know. This picture was taken 2 days after Kennedy's assassination in 1963. Johnson returns from Dallas. He's at Blair House. He invites Eisenhower. He calls up Eisenhower that night when he gets back and says, I've always needed you. I need you now more than ever. Eisenhower drives down from Gettysburg, pays his respects at the Capitol, goes to see Johnson. And he writes out that day for Johnson on legal pad the 10 or 12 things that Johnson needs to say to the Congress the next day. And at the top of the list, Eisenhower puts, you need to take 2 or 3 things from Kennedy's agenda and put them through. And you know Eisenhower didn't agree with any of them. You knew their old relationship hadn't been that. But he knew, and he told Johnson that the most important thing he could do for the country was to unite the country, put it back together, mend it, heal it. And the way to do it was to pass something or several things in honor of Kennedy. Again, hard to imagine. By the time the 1965, 66 years were coming, and Vietnam was tearing Johnson's presidency apart a little bit, that would really come later. Johnson would send up to Eisenhower's ranch every week a general, all of the papers from Vietnam, get his reports, get his impact. At one point, Johnson invited Eisenhower to the White House to run a National Security Council meeting. Kind of hard to imagine now. This is a picture that I stuck in because I think these two men are also misunderstood in so many ways. Obviously, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford had a complicated relationship, but most people don't know that they were both in the House in 1948, 49. When Gerald Ford is sworn in from Grand Rapids, Michigan, by Sam Rayburn in 1949, the first person to come up to him and shake his hand is Richard Nixon. They would carpool together for a couple of years. And I think that what I like to say about this picture is that this is a few days before Nixon resigned. A lot of people think Ford pardoned Nixon, because he had some deal or something like that. I think Gerald Ford knew that his presidency could not really begin until Watergate was really passed. His presidency never would have gotten off the ground, and in some ways the presidency would have been hurt if he hadn't put it behind us. He paid a big political price for that move, but I think he preserved the presidency. It's another way in which the club, I think, works to preserve the power of the office. This is from a chapter I call 3 Men and a Funeral. This is a very strange picture. Think about it. That's a picture of the 1970s. It was taken in 1981 when Ronald Reagan sent these 3 men to the funeral of Anwar Sadat. They all arrived at Andrews Air Force Base within 30 or 40 seconds of each other on identical planes before leaving. None of them knew which president was supposed to get out of the plane first because they weren't sure what the protocol was. So they all kind of stood there at the doorway of their planes waiting for the president. Finally, President Nixon said, "It's Carter. He goes first." And it was a little complicated. They went down to the White House. They met with President Reagan. I think the Bushes were there that day. Had coffee, got back on the helicopters, one in the Carter, Reagan. And they got on the helicopter and they decided, okay, we've got to stop. They were calling each other, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President. And finally, Ford, the pragmatic Midwesterner, said, why don't we just make it Dick, Jimmy, and Jerry for the purposes of this trip? They were all dressed in suits. They took off their suits. They each put on cardigans. I think they all had a drink. By the time they were over Bermuda, things that were much more relaxed. This is the old Air Force One, the 707. It was noisy. It was cramped. There's no privacy anywhere in this plane. It was a weird plane load. Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, Stevie Wonder. These guys. All on the little plane. Someone should make a movie out of that scene. But what's great about this story is we see this over and over again in the club. Men of different parties get along a little better than the ones from the same party. On the way back, Nixon peels off on a secret mission. What else? And Ford and Carter are alone on the plane now, and they actually sit down and talk for the first time since their bitter election in 1976. And guess what? They have stuff in common. They both have to raise money for a library. Neither of them particularly like it. They both have to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. Each man would spend more than 30 years after the presidency. And over the next 25 years, they would do something like 24 different projects together. Budget stuff, arms control, American agendas, overseas elections. They got to the point where each would promise the other man to give the eulogy of whoever died first. An astonishing thing for two men who had fought bitterly, an honor that fell to Carter when President Ford died in 2006. It's a great story of, and President Ford used to say that we got to be so friendly that we didn't like leaving. When we were in the limo together, we didn't like to leave. Just a bond. When you've sat in that chair and made the hard decisions, you share something that's bigger than party or age or difference. I put this in just for the silhouettes. There's really no story that goes with it. But the President's Club is not all kumbaya. It's not always perfect. These two men fought a battle royal over 5 years and 2 presidential campaigns and about how to bring the war to Vietnam to an end. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson had wanted to do it. He was trying to bring the war to an end, so before he left office, he'd found out through some questionably legal surveillance means that Richard Nixon was talking to the South Vietnamese, saying, "Don't make a deal. You'll get a better deal when I'm president." Johnson called that treason, but he had this was 1968. We'd had 2 assassinations that were unbelievable. Chicago had been a very difficult convention. He didn't want to make it public, and so he did not go public with that information. He let Nixon know that he knew that he knew, but he didn't go public with it, which was an act of great, I think, forbearance. And it probably cost Humphrey the election, but it would have been odd if that had been the reason that Humphrey had won. And this is one of the reasons Nixon built Johnson the clubhouse. He wanted to make sure Johnson was happy, because he knew what Johnson knew. So he built the clubhouse, and he threw birthday parties for Johnson down on the river and out in California. He named practically a national park after Johnson, and it was just a very long courtship. Until Watergate happened, and in 1973, the Senate was coming after Nixon, so he calls down to the ranch. Johnson's still alive, and says, "If you don't tell your friends in the Senate to stop this Watergate stuff, I'll tell them that you were bugging me back in 1968. To which Johnson says, "And if you do that, I'll tell them what I heard." 2 men blackmailing each other. It's a great story. And the reason we didn't find out about that is that 2 days later, Lyndon Johnson dropped dead of a heart attack. Not every president is an easy partner. Some are more difficult than others. In September of 2012, September 7th, my birthday as it turns out, Jimmy Carter became the longest living former president in American history, 31 years, 8 months, and 21 days, and counting. After he lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980, he went back to Plains, Georgia, was a little depressed, and proceeded to start his memoirs. 31 years later, he's written something like 22 books. I've lost count myself. He has done everything imaginable. He's redefined what it means to be a former president. And almost every president since then has sent him somewhere on a secret mission. Dealing with Jimmy Carter is a two-faced coin. If you ask him to go somewhere and do something, odds are is that he'll do it. Odds are also likely that he'll do 5 things you asked him not to do. He is very famous for saying, "I've been a better former president than I was president." That's partly because he's had 7 times longer to be a former president. But he also says things like this: "I feel that my role as a former president is probably better than that of other presidents." That's not club behavior. So he's a complicated man. I should tell you this now before I forget it. You know, when President Obama came around to sending Jimmy Carter on a mission in 2010 to North Korea, Obama made him sign a prenup. It was a 10-point contract saying that if you go and do this mission for me, he watched what happened with President Clinton and President Bush. Mr. Carter was particularly impossible about the Gulf War and tried and did things that were almost as treasonous as what Nixon had done to Johnson. But Obama had seen all that and said, okay, I'm going to make you sign a contract, and you can do this and not that, and say this and not that, and go here and not there. And the last one was, and you will never talk to the press about it. And I found out about that when Carter told me. This is a picture most people have never seen. I had not seen it till the book was done. Not many people knew that these two presidents met each other. When Bill Clinton became president, there were 5 former living presidents, and he went up to see Ronald Reagan in L.A. one day before he was sworn in, and went to see him pay his respects. And he asked President Reagan, "Do you have any advice for me?" And President Reagan said, "Yeah, go to Camp David. It's good for the heart and soul. Get out of that house." And the other thing he said was, "I've been watching you on the campaign, and I got to say, you know, you don't know how to salute. You have the wimpiest salute I've ever seen." And Clinton, always eager to please, leaned forward and said, "Well, can you teach me how?" Now, this had to be a great moment because here's Bill Clinton, who spent a lot of his campaign explaining why he was not in the military. And President Reagan, who had not only been in the military, but had been in 41 movies playing someone who was in the military. And he had an exquisite understanding of that whole perception thing and leadership. So the two men stand up in Reagan's office, and Reagan proceeds to give Clinton a saluting clinic. I'm not making this up. It's true. And at the end of the clinic, President Reagan gave President-elect Clinton the best thing he could possibly give anyone, the bowl of jelly beans. And it's easy to make fun of that, except that jar of jelly beans sat on Clinton's desk for 8 years. I want to skip over this one, but it's just an amazing thing that these two men actually became late-night phone pals. During the year that Nixon was still alive, Clinton would call. Nixon really wanted to be back in the mix. He wanted to be consulted. He was on his 20-year redemption tour, and Clinton eventually would call, and they would talk late at night, China and Russia and the Middle East. But mostly Clinton asked Nixon, "How do you do this job? When do you eat? When do you get up?" Nixon liked that because he remembered asking Eisenhower that question. And it's just a kind of a surprise partnership. Well, let me just say about this. I don't think there's any journalist, historian, observer who can imagine, who could presume what it was like to witness this moment in the Oval Office the night that George W. Bush was sworn in and his father was there. I don't think any of us can imagine. George W. Bush has written about this eloquently in his memoirs, saying that words couldn't be spoken, and I suspect that's true. As a father, I can imagine that that's true. Many books have been written about this relationship. I've read all of them. I can't find anything convincing about any of them. All of my writing and interviewing tells me that everyone is missing the forest for the trees here. This is a relationship that is first and foremost one about fathers and sons. I have 3 sons. It's hard for me to imagine me ever giving any advice, much less having my sons listen to it. But I think having sat in the Oval Office himself and having watched other presidents long before he was president and know the intelligence they get and know the advice they get, I think President Bush, the senior, looked at all of President Bush Jr.'s advice and said, the one role I can play here, the one thing I can do that no one else can do, is be his dad. And I think that's the role most of us would have played if we'd had this amazing chance. It's amazing that we all lived through this, I think, in American history. This had not happened before, and who knows if it will ever happen again. Inside the fraternity, there's an interesting fraternity, there's another relationship. I just want to talk about this in front because most people don't know that these two men became friends because of President George W. Bush. It was in 2005 that the second President Bush looked around and had a problem both first with the tsunami in Indonesia and then later in Katrina and said, who could possibly fix this? Who has the Rolodexes that are big enough? Who has the global rock star status to organize a nation and the world in a private way? And he hit upon, I think, a brilliant solution. And he somehow got these two men who had faced each other just 8 or 9 years before to be partners. And it's a partnership not that different from Truman and Hoover or Eisenhower and Johnson. Men of different parties who'd come together to solve a problem. Now, I think, I've interviewed both men about this. Each gives the other credit, but I'm more convinced than ever that it just was the right thing at the right moment. My favorite story about this, of course, is the expression that some of the Bush sons have given to Clinton, brother from another mother. It's really hard to top that. I think a couple of years ago there was an event at the Kennedy Center. I think I've got this right, but you can correct me if I've got it wrong. And there was a tribute for President Bush, and his sons were there. Carter was there. Clinton was there. Of course, he was probably there early. And President Clinton stood up and in front of all these people said to President Bush, what better tribute? He actually said, "I love you." That's a feature of the club we hadn't seen before. But my favorite moment came after, or maybe it was just before that. They were all backstage, the whole Bush family, 27 or 28, all lined up ready for a picture. I think Laura had wanted a picture, and so we got everyone together, and Carter and Clinton were over here, and finally I think it was Neil said, Bill, come on, get in the picture. So then there were 29 Bushes. It's great, just amazing. I stuck this picture in because it brings us up to the current, and I also wanted you to see the really good eye contact here. As I said before, presidents of the same party don't always get along as well as presidents from different parties. There's a lot in this book about Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and how they danced around each other for almost 50 years. From 1947 to Reagan's death, long time, really complicated relationship. Clinton and Carter, very, very complicated. And this one's interesting because it's part of what we're living through now. And I think what makes this relationship so fraught is that they're rivals for history's favor. They're both still in the news. They're both still part of the ongoing activities. And the two men have one really big disagreement that they don't talk about much. And it's, what's the best way in a center-right era when the nation is essentially still center to conservative? How do you advance a progressive or democratic agenda in that environment? It's hard. You can see that it's hard, and they have different ideas about how to do it. Clinton kind of thinks you should do it from the middle. Do it from the middle, Obama doesn't really get that yet. He may get there. He isn't there yet. I don't think he's going to get there, but we'll see. And I think Clinton feels that he has been through this, and he knows where the traps are. In 2007, Obama wrote that book, Audacity of Hope, and he said about Obama, he said about Clinton that he represents an old-fashioned kind of Democrat. And we need to move past partisanship. And I'm sure Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton read that book and thought, have you met any Republicans? Really? Clinton had this great expression when he was president saying, being president is going out every day and trying to do deals with people who are trying to kill you. So it's an ongoing relationship. It's quite fraught. And that handshake's pretty warm, too. Did you see that? I just want to make sure. Okay. And I want to finish with this picture because it's one of my favorites. This is taken in the Oval Office at a lunch that President George W. Bush organized for the club. President, Bush got this lunch together about 2 weeks before President Obama was sworn in. And he said during the lunch and afterward, we want you to succeed. All of us who have served in this office understand that the office transcends the individual. And you might have thought that these men got together and talked about the Middle East or talked about Congress or something like that, but I think they actually, best I can tell, they talked about how to raise daughters. in the White House because daughter, 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 daughter. All of them had daughters there at some time or another. And you can imagine how hard that is. And, you know, the other thing that strikes me as important about this picture is something about us. A couple of months ago, they had an election in France, and Nicolas Sarkozy was tossed out in favor of François Hollande. And at the time, the French press was so relieved by Hollande's election because, you know, Sarkozy was not very French. He liked Americans. And Hollande was, he'd come from the right part of town, he'd gone to the right schools, and he was a member of the right clubs, and he'd had the right jobs, and it was much better for France that we had a traditional, someone who'd come from all the right clubs in the Élysée Palace finally once again. And I heard that, and I thought, that's so funny, because when you look at this group of men, and you think, there isn't a club in America that would have all of them as a member. But that's our club. We made this club. They don't have a whole lot to say, have some, but not a whole lot to say about who gets in it. We decide, and we're pretty good at picking them. And when you add Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy and Ronald Reagan and Harry Truman, it really becomes the kind of club that would probably give France a migraine headache, but to us seems totally normal. It is a reflection of who we are, because we've never stood on ceremony about that kind of thing. We really believe that anyone can grow up to be president. We don't let everyone grow up to be president, but we do believe it's possible. And that's the strength of the presidency and of our system, and it's reflected here, I think, in this club in ways that I think we're still beginning to understand, and which I'm actually understand much better now than when I started this. So I think I'll stop there. I could talk for hours, but I think I've done enough. So thank you very much.
So if you'll turn the lights up, Michael will take a few questions here before we end this evening. Have at it. This is the other side of, rather than you asking questions.
And you can ask one too.
I might come up with a really good one. You're
okay. Okay. So, someone must have a question, and it could be about Fred. Well, that's your cue to ask something. No? Yes, sir.
Sir, the question I have is, how much of a role, whether it's similarities or differences, does generation play? I mean, when I say that, I think of, you go to the Museum of the Pacific War out in Fredericksburg, and they have the Plaza of the Presidents, for every president from FDR to Bush 41 who served in World War II in some capacity. And now that we've had 3 presidents who come from the post-World War era, do you think the generations affect how the presidents view the club? Do you think the World War II generation maybe view it a little differently?
This club is very interesting at the moment. Let me answer it in a backwards way. If you look at, I'm not into numerology, but this is a really interesting club at the moment when you just break it down into pieces. The 2 men on the end, both born in 1924. Both served in the Navy. Not a whole lot in common after that. These 2 men, both born in 1946, both turned 67 this year. The 2 closest people in the entire American presidency by birth, something like 42 days apart. Nobody's that close. Of course, and they're very different. In fact, they occasionally have gone on the road and given speeches together, and they, to the extent that they liked it, they did a little of that. But they have, you know, you would think of them as very different, but they actually are the closest 2 born in our history. I think the next 2 is, I think, Grover Cleveland and himself. But I mean, there's just nobody comes close. And then Barack Obama, who was born after, is a, you know, at the very end of the baby boom. My feeling about this, though, is that we're electing our presidents, you know, younger, and they're living longer. and hopefully they will teach each other things when possible. I think there's a limit to how much back and forth you really get with them. But I think someone asked me a lot whether, just for example, whether a woman would fit in. And I think if the club can transcend these differences, it can transcend any difference. Yes, sir.
I would like to say first that the book was excellent.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it, and one tough to put down. The Kennedy debacle, the Kennedy debacle that you described, it contained items that either I mean, that contained statements that I had either forgotten or the public was never really told about.
Mm-hmm.
Which do you think is right? I do not remember some of the things well that you described, the changing the president changing his mind at last minute in a fairly tense, dangerous situation for lots of people.
I should say, by the way, sorry, Nancy Gibbs, my co-author, who really is the brains of this operation, I'm just the muscle. She wrote the chapters up through Richard Nixon, and she's a much better historian than I am, I think. And I tend to trust everything she does, and I'm sure she's right about things. I also have lots of things I forget. Things I think I knew, and then I realize I've forgotten them. And so I just suspect it may be a mixture of both. We found that what was heartening for us is that the presidents came together across the whole period to do good things together. And it's easier for them sometimes after office than in office, but a lot of it takes place in office. And I think that the aid Eisenhower gave to Kennedy after was really helpful. He changed the way he did his foreign policy organization in the White House. After the Bay of Pigs, Eisenhower reads in the Riot Act, and then he went to a different system called the Executive Committee, which worked really well when the Cuban Missile Crisis came a year later. I think Eisenhower had a big hand in getting Kennedy to change. So that was a good thing. That's not a great answer to your question, but I do think there were positive impacts even in the Kennedy era of the club. The club is kind of our nickname for this. I don't want to make it seem like these guys are getting together secretly and banging on drums. You know, it doesn't happen. That's the way if this ever becomes a movie, it will be disaster, I'm sure. It'll be secret meetings all the time. But I think those one-on-one conversations are really helpful sometimes. Other times, not so helpful. Gene. We felt that Herbert Hoover. We started Herbert Hoover because we didn't think we had time to do the whole thing, and no one would buy a book about all of them, so we had to pick a hunk. But Hoover's story is amazing. He becomes sort of the devil incarnate after his term, and yet he goes on to do these amazing things in retirement that we felt we didn't know about them. And I thought, well, and then that's a great story. And then he goes on to suggest to Truman the idea of a club. So we thought, if we could, in some ways, Hoover's the founding father of the thing. And that's, we thought, was the way to pay tribute to him. He needed a partner, it takes two to tango, and Truman was ideal. Clearly, Roosevelt never would have been. One thing I think the presidents know that we don't know, that I learned, is that every man serves, so far only men, serves in a time where his temperament is suited for it. There's always this historical game of, well, what if we took, a Nixon and put him in the Civil War? We're all part of our own times, and they are suited for their era. And some partnerships work better than others. So I think we just had to start somewhere, and we wanted to pay a tribute to Hoover, who we thought was undervalued. Yes, sir, on the aisle.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you being here. As a student at Bush School, and kind of young professionals in public service, we study a lot of men and their careers, especially because of Bush year. What would be kind of advice you might give us, some younger people about for careers in public service, how to study the so-called leaders of that field in the book?
Well, asking a journalist to give advice about public service is just a really bad piece of road. Because I'm not sure that's our line of work at all. But I do have sons who are thinking in these terms, and what I tell them is just do any service you can, in any capacity. And if you can you don't have to go to Washington to do it. There are important things happening in every city and every state capital, in some ways more important, since there are things happening in those places and there aren't in Washington. And just get in anywhere you can, and you will be amazed by what a difference you can make, and how soon. I think that seems hard to imagine, maybe when you're still in school, but it's quite. The door is more open than you might guess, and everyone needs help, and they all need good ideas. So I think be bold. That would be the best advice I would give you. That's what I say. You'll cut me off when I'm. Yes, sir.
Now that you're reported dead, who is Jimmy Carter closest to? I've seen this photo from a different angle, and Carter seems to be standing off.
That's a question I don't know the answer to. I think even people who worked for Jimmy Carter when he was in the White House report that he was a very a singular fellow. Always felt that he knew what he was doing best, and was difficult to bond with. That has been true certainly in the club. When I'm in I sometimes say that every club needs a black sheep, something for the others to complain about. And to some extent, Carter fulfills that role here because he can be difficult. He was the only person who gave me any details about the lunch, but mostly he complained about there wasn't enough food. That's going to get me in trouble. I can. My head was turned around so many times in the course of doing the research, I've lost count. Whether it was Hoover's astonishing role, the Nixon-Reagan relationship being so fraught, I found it to be head-snapping all the way through, and I come away optimistic. I'm not disheartened by this. I think it's a kind of an inspiring story at some level, and that's head-snapping. We all need that. And I think that's one of the reasons it's I think been somewhat that's had something of a response, because we don't see this kind of partnership and cooperation and compromise. President Bush and President Clinton handed out in the wake of Katrina something like $160 million, and for a while they just sat down and figured it out between the two of them, which is the way we ought to be doing things. And after that, they just agreed that each could do with a certain amount of money whatever they liked. That's trust. That's missing. So trust, cooperation. These are basic things that we need. And all that I find inspiring, certainly. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, in the jacket.
Thank you for your insightful presentation on the long view of the president. Obviously, the club appears to be triggered by the question, how do you do this job when they basically start on their career as president? As far as you know, has the current president asked the question, how does the economy work?
Let's just stop the questioning right there. I'll try to answer that. My favorite story about President Obama actually is about President George W. Bush. And it goes like this. President Bush left office and moved to Dallas, and as he said once or twice, but famously, the president deserves my silence, which is a courtesy that the club typically pays to its successors. And President Bush has abided by that. I think once in 4 years, President George W. Bush has said something that was, at once, there was a sentence that was sort of ever so gentle in its suggestion that maybe energy policy might be a little, just maybe not here but there, constructive. And he followed that up in the next sentence by saying, but I don't think our country should criticize our president when he's under pressure, which is pretty much what Eisenhower said about Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, and it's pretty much what Hoover said when Truman was coming under fire for trying to expand the government and expand the powers of the presidency. There is a courtesy that the club pays. They will help if called, but they aren't going to make mostly unwanted suggestions. And I think that's because even the ones who are successful know what it's like to sit in that chair. They know the scars and the bruises. And even when you made the right call, there are no easy calls. There are no ones you don't regret. There are no easy, there are no good outcomes. If the decisions were easy, they wouldn't have reached the president. So they all know that they're going to be second-guessed and may even second-guess themselves for the rest of their lives. That's a huge burden they all wear. You don't see it, but it's all there. They've all got it. And we ask a lot of these men, and I think they repay that respect back to each other when they're out of office. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael. A couple of extra matters here before we depart. First of all, we love having you back here in College Station. A little souvenir token of your being here. Thanks for being here.
I know what to do with this.
I think you will, yes. And thanks for a really, really great book that we've all enjoyed and that add to the texture of this great nation in which we live. We're also really lucky here in College Station for another reason, because George and Barbara Bush have been in College Station twice in the last 7 days. And let me tell you, that is absolutely fabulous. So if you would please, sort of, like we do in church sometime, get to know the person sitting next to you. If you've been rude and hadn't done so yet, this is sort of, get-together hour so that we can allow the President and Mrs. Bush to depart and Michael to depart. Michael, we'll be going out to the lobby. We've got refreshments and light hors d'oeuvres, as well as a book signing table where you can go acquire your own personal copy of the President's Club with Michael's signature affixed there, too. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and you remain on our list for our future events. Thanks a bunch.